Thank you, Jimena. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for this invitation. And adding to what Jorge was saying, our vision was in some way to scale up the research in order to respond, or rather raise some questions. The first question was, what were we going to find up there? There wasn't a catalog or any documentation where we could see the information of what we could find in the high Andean ecosystems. So in this first slide, we see what we found in the year 2013 in the system. So we traveled through 22. There are 25 in total, and those of them that have more abundance in flora and fauna are 22. These are the ones where we can find some sort of trace from these animals. So our flora and fauna team, and as part of the team, my objective was to present the evidence we found. So some of the background, as Jorge mentioned, to our left, we have Chile. Chile is one of the longest country in the hemisphere, and it's very particular because at the southern part it's part of a island system. In fact, many years ago, when we started to discover the system, it was seen as an isolated one. So with that principle, we started raising questions. For example, how would these animals be distributed within the system, and how would they be in the basic process of the high Andean region? So you see here a distribution, which is A. The letter A shows us how it moves from the coast to the Andean region. So this is the geography from 0 degrees of altitude up to the 900s that we can reach at the salt flats. Of course, we cannot reach the highest one, which is 6,900. We only reached the UNAC region with 5,000 meters. And that's where the study took place for the last 5 or 6 years. In image B, you're able to see a map with some colors. So yes, in image B, in red, you see the proposal that Jorge presented of some systems. These are the systems that we proposed with the Forestry Commission in order to have a protection area. So at the lower part of image B, you see that the current national park, Nevado Tres Cruces, is there, and to the right, that same map, you see a small square, which is in red, and not so long ago, this was established as a potential protected area. And in image C, we see how in this area of the high Andean region in green, we see rainfall, and from north to south, there's less rainfall in the north than in the south. So as my colleague just mentioned, this establishes that water concentration will attract more life to some places than others. And that's why the national park, Nevado Tres Cruces, was built there, or rather limited there. Having said that, our task was to assess in what way the systems within this huge context in the highest part of the Atacama region, how they were facing what was coming. And so we found very pristine areas. However, from 2014 to 2020, in image D, all the sectors that are in red are sectors that have a permit for exploration. This is an exploration permit, not exploitation permit yet. However, there is a environmental qualification resolution which allows companies, once they do their exploration, if it's positive, they could be able to exploit it. So out of the 22 systems that are there, 9 have exploration permits, including the largest salt flats. So continuing with the water issue, here in the southern part where we have most of the rainfall throughout the year, we see this salt flat up here, and it's one of the most important salt flats here in the symposium called Maricumbo, which is in this part of the region. And as Jorge mentioned, it's linked to another system, which are more to the south, to the east and west. So it's quite an intense area. So that part that was chosen to be exploited had permits since 1988. But 7 years ago, no more than 7 years ago, a new law, 1913, allowed them to explore first and to exploit the land afterwards. These systems allows us to see how 3/4 of what we have studied could be exploited nowadays. To the left, the red circle in the middle has the Maricumba salt flats, and to the right we have the green lagoon. Two important centers that have been assessed over the last 6 or 7 years. What did we find? That's the most important question. There is a very important researcher in Chile called Gajardo, and he established certain formats of vegetation, and we were able to find 5. Out of those 5 types of vegetation, separating flora and fauna and vegetation from the system, we were able to establish 21 species with 12 families. They were distributed among the salt flats, rivers, and lagoons. And this is the main design of it. We understand that the first condition in order to have life is flora and vegetation for larger animals, of course. So during these 5 or 6 years that we worked there, we realized that in these 22 systems, there were only 21 species. And this might appear like a low number. However, we need to take into account the conditions, which are quite variable and extreme. If we were to assess, for example, when we talk about the load charge of a system, the Malthusiana region gives us exponential numbers, but in the 60s and 70s, and even nowadays, we know that in order to establish these load capacities for the system, they need an important load of variables. This is where we have the important role of chemistry and physics united with biology. That's how we were able to establish the systems and how they were developing, and we were able to find the different species of vertebrae that we were looking for. So once we determined the fauna within the system, we found 5 species of reptiles, 10 species of mammals, and 62 birds, species of birds. This is important because although it's a low number, you need to consider all the variables that need to come together in this system, where we have 2 or 3 meters of snow at some points, or even more, and the rainfall is high during the austral winter. We also need to consider summer season is very long, and 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 the heat is very high. So we need to take all of these factors into account, these physical, chemical, and biological factors that are united in one space and that will only allow the survival of the fittest. And so there are 2 species that we assess, those with high mobility and low mobility. The low mobility species are the ones we're looking at, reptiles. 4 of them are endemic, which means that only belong to the Atacama region and the High Andean region. And one of them, which is the 5th species, is a micro-endemic species. It means that it can only be found in one of the areas of the whole region. Also, the mammals we found, which were 10, such as foxes and micro mammals, are distributed randomly throughout all the systems we assessed. Fortunately, these mammals are able to move more than reptiles, and that's why we find them distributed amongst all the systems. And finally, migratory bird species. They fly, so it's easy for them to fly from one water of land to another one, depending on the characteristics as well. Even though there are some systems that have extreme specificities with the salt levels and many other characteristics, we still found birds. So we found most birds, and we found 13 species of flamingos, the 3 of them, which are present in Latin America, and ducks as well. So large number of ducks in all 22 systems. So we can say the following. Although all systems have different characteristics and allow 74 species to live within them, our second question was, what level of protection do these areas have? Because they have vertebrate animals, fauna, and flora and vegetation. And we realized that out of the 9 most important ones, only one of them was mostly protected, which is the Maricumba salt flat. The other ones that have an association with important elements of fauna didn't have any type of protection. And this is why we decided to modify the system in order to expand the existing park, or have a new park, or find another system to protect the animals in this area. So here in table A, you will see the biological matrix. This means how biologically animals are linked within the sectors that do not have protection, the ones that we recommend to protecting, and the national park. And you'll see it's quite interesting because it allows us to interpret all systems as quite unified. There are very few animals that are outside the protection reserve. However, when you see slide B, you will be able to find 3 different situations. So what's not protected and doesn't have any proposal is independent from what is proposed and from what exists. And that's where we have our main concern of exploiting some of the systems. Yes, go.
Así se ve el sistema altoandino cuando uno lo visita.
This is the Andean plateau. When you visit it, you can see a large number of elements. And this is Maricunga, the salt field for the symposium, where we can see the way in which it's divided. As my colleague said, a system on the right-hand side, you can see the picture of how it looks physically. We can see the different type of vegetation, the different fauna, flamencos, ducks, but from an administrative standpoint, it cannot not be divided or broken up, because when you exercise pressure in one part of this area, the red one, the pressure will exercise the same on the southern region. Hence, it would indicate that although it is protected, if the system is exploited, in some way or another, things will be seen altered concerning those animals that live on that side of the salt flat. And this is the system at present today. We have stated, let's go back one slide, we have said that each one of these elements, the salt fields or the lagoons or the rivers that are altered in a certain way, will cause some sort of conditioning, which will not allow the normal development of these animals. And this for a simple reason, as I said, because things haven't been assessed fully, the load capabilities and the collectiveness, the rates, the occurrence, the indexes. Well, as a matter of fact, we do have a baseline, but we're only able to say what exists in terms of abundance, only that, and maybe in terms of density. But it's impossible at present to be able to give you more elements to be able to say to the authorities or companies that are exercising these pressures what might happen within the system. Let me repeat that. One back. This is the Maricunga salt pan under the conditions in which we found it. This is the lateral sector that Jorge spoke about, Santa Rosa. The next one, where we're able to see an important amount of information for a report provision or taking, and this is how we saw it 9 years ago. And probably things have changed somewhat. And here we're able to see the formation of the Lama River, which is besides, or it is part of the Santa Rosa, it's part of El Pantanillo and Maricunga, adjacent to this. And here we can see Lagoon of Negro Francisco. It's the most central lagoon throughout the world, where we see a large concentration of flora, vegetation, vertebrates in all the studies that have taken place. Let me stop here a few moments. It has to do with Laguna Verde, although it's a sector that has no protection whatsoever, but it's at the highest level. It's being explored at present, and like Maricunga, it has they've been working here, and it'll not stop. Now, the problem here concerning these sectors is the following.
Una nueva fotografía, ¿no es cierto?, de
And
cómo
this is
se
a new picture. This is Maricunga and Laguna Verde. This is the contrast between both systems. Now, when I was talking about the low mobility animals, I was talking about reptiles, especially here in this region. And here in the Andean highlands, we can find 5 species. They're distributed and they're under the conservation category. What does it mean? Well, under which conditions they're found, following certain parameters. Are they in danger? Are they vulnerable? Under extinction? And unfortunately, many are not. Or fortunately, many are not. So what we're seeing, what's happening, these species that live in these specific locations, they're incapable of moving towards other locations. The mobility range of these animals is not more than 25, 30 meters. Thus, it means if somebody exploits this ecosystem, surely they might alter their environment. And this might mean a high rate of mortality, a low rate of migration, and of course, other issues. But the concerning thing when we talk about Maricunga and we talk about Laguna Verde, we find 2 species which are endemic in the region of the Andean Plateau, and in certain cases, they're micro-endemic. In other words, this means the darker line that I drew there that points to the 3 individuals, which are called Lialemus andino, are only found in this lagoon. Hence, it means if it's explored and then exploited, talking of the lagoon, then the individual will disappear. In other words, the possibility of extinction is quite high. This means that in the mid and long range, if you analyze any study that you wish to utilize, well, we'll see that as a matter of fact, these species, because of the large amount of animals, the density of individuals found there, that at present it has nothing to do with the load capability of the system that allows them to survive. In other words, it's the alteration, the pressure that will be exercised on these animals might do them or eliminate them from the system. And this is serious, taking into account that animals, to be able to be rescued and relocated, otherwise there should be sites with similar characteristics. Unfortunately, each Andean plateau is independent and it's different. Hence, in conclusion, there are no 2 Lagunas Verdes, neither 2 Maricundas. In other words, what we get from Maricunda and what is transferred to another location, if that's our intention to be able to solve this exploitation system and suffering of these animals, well, these locations would not be found. In conclusion, concerning the low mobility organisms, in this case, 2 important species for the Andean Plateau, eventually, if these regions are exploited because water is the most relevant part of the system, and if there's no water, of course, it will affect the flora and vegetation, and thereafter, it will affect vertebrae. And the first vertebrate line that exists in these sectors are reptiles, which are the most sensitive under these circumstances. Mammals, they're lucky enough, and here we can see the Lycolopex scopeus, puma, tongue color, that's found. We did find it when working out there, when researching the Andean Plateau. The difference between mammals and reptiles, mammals can move, and they can move big distances. In other words, a fox can more or less move 7 kilometers in a night. The puma, 180 kilometers, where they can move around. Hence, they will be affected in a lesser degree. They have more spaces to be able to move towards, but there are other mammals like rats, for example, at least 2 species, which is the Abrotix olivaceae and the Philus antilophyxus. Although they do move, they're more sensitive because I insist each one of the sectors that we checked, Maritunga, Laguna Verde, Santa Rosa, Pantanillo, they have different characteristics. In other words, if I move this animal and I locate it otherwise for this animal to reproduce and continue with a normal development, well, this is something to be seen because extreme conditions in the Andean Plateau are not similar to other locations in the case of Chile and in the world at large. The good news, nevertheless, is that although certain sectors might be exploited, in other words, 9 of the 22 that we have assessed, surely birds will be the least affected, or apparently the least affected. In this region, fortunately, there aren't many places where we have been able to determine that there are bird nests, particularly talking about the flamingos. Out of the 3 species, there are 1 or 2. But no, it hasn't been quite successful in a natural way because they prefer other regions, other sectors, like, for example, other regions a little bit more distant, 200, 300 kilometers distant. But other species, like, for example, the ducks and the other birds, which are smaller birds and passerine birds, do nest in these sectors. So eventually a reduction in water might eventually affect them, but no monitoring system has been defined that might establish the second baseline after exploitation to be able to establish which will be the measures taken in the near future. And I wanted to show you here a few of the greatest things that you can find up above. These are the 3 species of flamingos. There are hawks, peregrine hawks, vicuñas, guanacos, reptiles, and micro mammals. All of them coexist in a network. In other words, they all depend one from each other. If, for example, I remove a fox and I remove a flamingo, or I do away with the existence of other species, the network is so intricate that each one of these 75 species does have a role, and the role still has not been specifically determined or faithfully defined within the Andean plateaus. But if water disappears or there is less water, importantly so, most probably is that some of these species will be extinct or on their path to extinction. As you can see on the map, we are trying to see how many animals and how these are distributed. The red circles, I'm placing the elements we're analyzing, which are Maricunga and Laguna Verde. These are 2 important sites. One, from an administrative perspective, it contains 50% for exploitation purposes, and eventually it might generate an important alteration in these systems. And on the right-hand side, Laguna Verde, where the same thing, unfortunately, will happen. And it's very difficult to establish which will be the consequences in a 5, 10, or 15-year period. Thank you. As conclusions, I wish to state that we're not against the existence of lithium mining. We merely need to think about how we will be managing each one of the actions that will take place. Generally speaking, in Latin America, legislation is quite lax and therefore or negligent. So definitely they are not clear with regards to effective remediation aspects when we talk about metal, non-metal, metallic mining circumstances. Hence, lithium mining, it's a good possibility from an economic perspective for a country. Undoubtedly, it's good, although it provides much labor, but this has to go hand in hand with effective measures or measures which will allow the flora and vegetation of these sensitive systems not suffer great alterations. Now, another element based on our judgment that might affect is non-regulated tourism, which does create alterations within these systems, because you might know that a van that goes through a sector or on a salt pan or on the edge of a lagoon, of course, they leave a lot of debris behind them. So let's remember you have the macrobiome carpets, the invertebrates, vertebrates, and others. Hence, alterations when you do not know how tourism needs to take place in a proper manner. Well, it's very important to understand what will happen and how things will be assessed with regards to the animals living there. And lastly, we wish to say that in spite of the big efforts, from the Catholic University and the regional universities with Antofagasta and with the regional government, our suggestions have not been used. In other words, to be able to assess how each one of these circumstances will be faced within these salt fields that will be explored and thereafter exploited, how to regulate tourism in these plateaus in the Andean region, how to apply each one of the recommendations that we're conveying with the goal in mind for each one of these exploitations to make sense, not only from an economic perspective, but also socially, but especially with regards to taking care of biodiversity. Thank you.